Okay, I'll get started. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Experience of Systems Approaches in Regional Water Planning. We're really pleased today to be joined by two speakers. Brendan Bromwich leads the systems group for Mott MacDonald's Water Consultancy Division, applying systems thinking to strategic national projects such as Water Resources South East, Anglian Region's Strategic Resource Options, and London's Sub-Regional Integrated Water Management Strategy. We're also joined by Trevor Bishop, Director at WRSE since January 2019, and as Director for Water Resources South East. Trevor's key responsibilities include strategy and policy for the development of a long-term regional resilience plan. As always, there's going to be the chance for questions at the end of these presentations, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and these will then be read out on your behalf later on. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us today, and a massive thank you to the speakers. Trevor, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethny, and a very good afternoon to everyone on the call today. So what Brendan and I would like to do over the next 45 minutes is really present some information and then have a discussion about the work that we and others have been involved in trying to hardwire the systems approach and system thinking into long-term water resource and environmental planning. I'm going to give some context and background that happened a couple of years ago, and then Brendan's going to bring us right up to date in the second half of the presentation on some really sort of cutting edge work that's taking place on this very important transition, particularly in terms of adaptation, climate change, etc., into the future, to make sure we make wise decisions now that will operate in the best interest of future generations. So I've just got a few slides to go through, if that's okay. This one is one of my favorite photos. There we go. This was taken in about April 2012. From 2010 till March 2012, we were in one of the most severe droughts that we've seen in much of England as a country for a number of decades. We had substantial environmental damage taking place, particularly in aquatic environments, but also other habitats. We had over 20 million people on restrictions on their water use. The Olympics were coming up and there were serious questions about whether there would be enough water to go around. This photo was taken literally a few days after the most severe events were in place, and it raises a really important question in this country, particularly: when does a drought end? Well, it doesn't end when it rains like cats and dogs after a very long, dry, hot period, because much of the water we rely on is groundwater, and it can take many months for it to recharge. So a really good downpour, even floods on the streets of London and in other places, doesn't mean a drought is ending. And that was a really important message that we had to work with government, with regulators, and with the public very much on. But this drought situation, because of its severity, in my view, triggered a change in thinking and really helped stimulate the acceptance in government and regulators, particularly, that a systems approach was going to be appropriate in the future. So before I go back on to some of those big sort of policy changes that took place, and then Brendan is going to explore how they then played out in more detail, just to put in context, who is Water Resources South East, because you may well not have heard of us. We're an alliance of the 6 water companies that supply over 20 million people in the southeast of England, supports about 40% of the UK's GDP. Secure, sustainable, safe water resources is absolutely fundamental to both of those elements. And of course, in the southeast, we face growth, we face climate change, environmental sustainability pressures. So working collaboratively and looking at the southeast as a system is a really important concept in its own, because in the past, each one of the water companies represented on this map, which I hope you can see with the resolution, would have planned in relative isolation, and now they plan collegiately together, collaboratively, to make sure it's the right solution on a much larger scale than we've seen in the past. So I talked about, well, what flowed from that quite worrying event in 2012, and one of the things that came out of it was the 2014 Water Act. I was fortunate enough to be involved with aspects of this, And part of it was drafting the resilience duty on Ofwat, who are the economic regulator for water, and effectively give water companies the okay on how much money they can spend and what level of environmental sustainability will be funded through customer bills, etc. So really important. Going back to this text now might well have written it slightly differently, knowing what I know now, if I knew it then, etc. But one of the big debates we've had at the time in 2012 and the build up to this during the Act and the Bill was very much water takers, supply networks was the initial language, and sewage undertakers, supply networks was the language. We worked really hard to build systems into this narrative for resilience, and that helped a number of subtle changes within regulators and the way this particular section of the 2014 Act has then translated into action on the ground in the way that we plan and think about water and environment. The other thing that happened after being involved with the 2014 Act, I then found myself, ironically, in Ofwat responsible for implementing that duty. So as you can see here, there were 7 principles that we put into resilience in the round, into what's called periodic review 2019. And at the very head of these principles, we put system thinking. And I think this is probably one of the first times in terms of an economic regulator for this kind of industry that systems thinking was put right at the very top of the set of principles that Ofwat expected water companies and others to integrate within their future planning processes. It's a long, slow journey, and Brendan and I will talk about culture as well as some of the practical and technical aspects of doing this, but it was a really important first step. But it wasn't just resilience at a sort of a local scale as well. We also wanted to make sure that we looked much broader. So on the back of the 2019 work, there were water resources groups, 5 of them produced across England and then linked into Wales. They looked not just at water resources on a company level and a regional level, but also looked by working together at water resources and environmental sustainability questions at a national level. And you can see on the right-hand side here, some of the big strategic schemes which are being looked at to move water around the country to make sure that the environment can be recovered where it's appropriate and water utilised where it's sustainable to do so. So a much broader picture into that planning context. On the left-hand side is my rather sort of sketchy representation of how we plan generally in England and Wales, certainly on the utility basis. As you can see, you know, we have a planning process for water resources, we have a planning process for wastewater, for flood risk, for multi-sector needs, and for many others. The links between these different planning regimes are really quite tenuous and not well developed. Because the world is so complex, we've put it into silos and we generally operate in silos. The recognition that climate change is really changing how we need to think, and we need to think on a systems level. So on the right-hand side, you can see how Water Resources South East made some initial tentative steps to say not just planning for public water supply, also planning for non-public water supply, the wider South East, which is the economy and societal needs, and very much the environmental systems, and to understand environmental resilience and not utilise the environment just as a natural resource to be utilised up to sustainable limits, but to understand how it could dynamically change in the future and how all those 4 components could work in combination and be adaptable to a changing future. We also adopted adaptive planning approaches, both for the pressures on future supply, demand and environmental pressures, but also in terms of the type of options. So we have different branch points at different points in time. And one of the key things to adaptive planning is making sure the decisions we make now in the short term are going to be adaptable to a wide range of future potential scenarios, but at the lowest level of risk and the lowest level of financial risk and exposure as well, to make sure they're societal and economically sustainable as well. And there's a whole conference on that issue alone. Brendan very much helped us with this, thinking about systems mapping and understanding our systems. This wasn't the first time people have done it, but probably one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive that I've seen. So a systematic rationale of the selection of metrics, showing the connectivity across water, power, agriculture, industry and leather, and some of the key results and analysis and great engagement, So hard and soft system features to create resilience are really important, to look at those two elements in combination. And for me, that was one of the key bits that I don't think we'd done sufficiently previously. I won't go through this in detail because Brendan's going to do a little bit more on some of the technical aspects of implementing this thinking later. But we adapted the Bolts and Brown approach to resilience. So we looked at reliability, adaptability, and vulnerability, and developed metrics that we could utilize to measure those against. What we have here is really coming out of some of this work is our thinking on what does future infrastructure look like? What are the characteristics? It not just that it delivers water or delivers sustainability in isolation, but the combination. So least cost, most efficient. Of course, that's going to be really important to economic regulators to get past the bar, but also whether it's sustainable, not just now, but under different futures, whether it's resilient against those characteristics I spoke about just now, whether it has a systems function. Each individual bit of infrastructure might be resilient in its own way, but how it operates in combination with other types of infrastructure is really important to sustainability for people and environmental resilience, public best value, and of course carbon, as you can imagine. What we have here is what's called a hotspot map on the left-hand side. This was published in Affinity Water's Water Resource Management Plan recently. So running those metrics through the system enable companies to understand where are the pinch points in their system. So they might have a really resilient reservoir or a really resilient groundwater scheme, but actually if all the components that feed into it and feed out of it, water quality, network, customer supply issues, etc., don't work in combination, it's only as strong as the weakest link in that chain. And that's what this work really helped us with. So system connectivity, system complexity, system reliability, shocks such as floods, etc., as well as water quality risks. And my final slide, because I need to give Brendan sufficient time. If you go to the Water Resources Plan, the consultation just closed yesterday, which is a bit sad for today's event, but hopefully if you have a look at that, you'll see the scale of investment that this work is driving, some £15.6 billion of investment. Some £5 billion of that is about environmental improvements and sustainability, so a very substantial sum. And about another quarter of it is due to growth, and about another quarter of it is due to climate change resilience effectively. So this slide just gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the types of schemes and options which are going to be developed over the next couple of decades. So what I'm going to do is end there and pass across to Brendan, who's going to take us and bring us up to date with some work that's taken place much more recently. So I'll stop sharing, Brendan, and over to you.
So I'm going to talk about the London sub-regional integrated water management strategy with which is an ongoing piece of work now, or coming towards the close of that, with just one slide on the Oxcam ARC integrated water management framework. Because that was the piece of work that I did following on from WRSE, and you'll see that some of the things we kind of pioneered really on WRSE, we've taken forward first in the Oxcam ARC integrated water management framework, and then in London. And what was interesting here is that the challenge was really about how could we integrate planning across water resources, wastewater, flooding, and environmental programs. So with WRSE, we took a systems perspective and did the system mapping to kind of identify and validate a set of metrics for resilience of water resources. But then in this project and in London, we had a number of different portfolios and we needed a new set of metrics. But in all three projects, it was really about kind of working out what is the system, what are the interconnections within it, what are we going to measure, what are we going to model, and then what are the outcomes of that modeling, ending up with a portfolio of options for implementation. We published some work on this jointly with EA's Chief Scientist's Office and Imperial College London, and I'll provide the link to that. In this document, really, we're showing a lot about what Imperial College's WRSE model can do. WRSE is a mass balanced model at the water body scale, so we can model water quality, water resources, and get some indication of flooding. So this kind of takes us forward in terms of integrated planning. I'll also share this document, which is a summary of the Oxcam ARC, and this is a little bit more accessible. It's an easier read in terms of how this approach can be applied. So it gives a little bit more context. So moving on to London, we've kind of taken this forward, integrating water resources, wastewater, flooding, and environmental kind of programming. This is our area of interest. In particular, we were given the Lower Lee, the bright green area, as a case study to kind of pilot this program. And we said right at the start, well, actually, we think we're gonna find that, you know, looking at the upstream catchment is going to be very significant in what happens within London, and you know, that's turned out to be the case. And so just to kind of put that out there as a whole catchment, a whole system approach, work out what the system boundaries are. And then some of the kind of priorities from the London side was that it had to be an adaptive strategy. It had to be collaborative. They wanted an integrated and a digital approach, and they didn't want a plan. They wanted something which is going to be an ongoing strategy which they can update. So we started off with a system mapping, and you'll see this is the same approach that we use for WRSE, is that what we do when we do a system mapping is we just kind of say, what is the system in this context? And so we would start, this is the flooding system, but we would be working concurrently with the wastewater, the urban planning, the agriculture, the river health systems, and we develop a simple system map of how it works. And we work on this case with the flooding constituency before kind of developing it more broadly. And in this case here, look, we've shown what are the impacts of flooding applicable in London. You know, where we're working elsewhere, we would develop this further, and it would be nuanced according to the context. And also we've shown, you know, how does climate change impact this? Develop it further and say, but what are the different categories of intervention that you can put in here? And here we see that these purple dots, purple nodes, different interventions, different options operate the system at different places where they change the hydrology or whether they change the impact of flooding. And then you can see that we're also bringing in some of the links with other systems. We've got the sewer, the wastewater system up there, and some of the urban system. And then we would say, okay, well, what on all of this are we going to measure? And just like the WRSE example, you know, here we've said, well, in order to understand how this system works, these are the items that we're going to measure. And as I said, we're doing this concurrently with other parts of the system as well. So we end up with a flooding, a river health, wastewater, water resources, urban planning, and agriculture map in which we have a set of metrics across this overall system. And you know, what's really key here is that this mapping process has provided an audit trail for collective understanding of a very wide range of technically and locally informed people. And, you know, as Trevor kind of alluded to with, you know, the kind of shocks that our systems are subject to, it was very striking that, you know, at the outbreak of pandemic, we also had that very hot, dry weather. So we got multiple shocks happening in combination. And, you know, for this informed technical judgment is a very significant contribution to how we understand these systems on the basis of difficulty of modeling everything, you know, in order to get those in combination impact. So this is quite significant, we think. So we've used this understanding, and we developed some scenarios about what does the future of London look like, and the scenarios methodology, again, I can provide a link to a scenarios methodology, is saying, well, what are the things which might happen together in combination in terms of the different ways that London would change? And in our analysis, we came up with 5 different ways that London could proceed. I mean, it may be that in country life there's more development rurally rather than respectively with London. That was one future. We had there are a lot of opportunity areas in London, and it may be these are developed, but then actually people don't move in and they don't really happen. So we had an unrealized urbanization. We had a city living, which really put together the a kind of coordinated urbanization. One regarding prosperous growth, and then another kind of environmental priority where people went a green route. And again, kind of the backdrop to this was quite interesting, given that this took place, I forget whether it was 2 or 3 different chancellors and prime ministers we had over the 6 weeks that we were doing this work, and it was quite clear there were some different visions of how the future might go in terms of prioritization. So it was just quite an interesting kind of backdrop to, oh, right, well, this week we might be on shifting towards, one of these other kind of potential futures. So what we end up with is, going back to that set of metrics, is the system maps is a set of metrics. And in WRSE, the metrics that we were validating with the system maps were, what is resilience? What is a resilient system? Whereas here we've got a broader set of metrics in terms of flooding outcomes and environmental outcomes and social outcomes, some of which come out of the modelling. And again, this is similar to WRSE, some of which come out of the modelling, some of which come out of other data sources where you've got to get these metrics from. This is the WRSE framework from Imperial College. As I say, a mass balance model applied at I think it's 11 water bodies in the area shown, and so it is higher level than some other modelling approaches, but that's significant for a reason that we'll come to. And these were the outcomes. So first thing we did was to model the different development scenarios. So on the left, you can see when we're using in general the WFD categories of outcome, this is the baseline we've got on the left. And under the different scenarios, looking 25 years ahead, what happens? And we've just highlighted, where there's a change. And we found in that we didn't actually need to kind of work with all 5. We found the city living and prosperous growth were fairly similar. The country life environmental priority were fairly similar. And we found the unrealized urbanization was fairly similar to the baseline. So actually what we've taken forward in our analysis was the city living and country life. So those are 2 scenarios of development. And then we took different scenarios, or climate scenarios forward for our analysis. And all this means is that we've looked at quite a large range of different ways that London could change in the future. And we've come up with a sensible amount of analysis to do. And then the way we use this is that we would show what the baseline is. We would show what the city living, we show what the scenario, how the scenario plays out in future. And then we would look at a number of different interventions and see how they address the scenarios that developed. Apologies there, just kind of slowed up, just realized we talk about WRSE on the left, and for those of you who don't know, WRSE is the Australian for SUDS, and so I was just tripped up a bit by that. I presented this in the middle of the night to Australia just recently and didn't connect it, so there's an extra bit of knowledge. So what we're finding is, it's very significant kind of looking at these systemic kind of impacts. Very important to pick up the second order impacts, because if you plan in one scenario, you will have kind of side effects in other scenarios. And so, for example, in this catchment, we found very significant trade-offs in terms of water quality, and how that water quality risks in the catchment would then influence the way kind of blending water would be used in kind of major treatment works, and that would have a knock-on effect on water resource availability across London. in terms of how much water gets taken up the Thamesley tunnel for use, and that has a second order impact in availability of water resources in West London, which is more susceptible to drought than North London. So it was very interesting to kind of see this. We really brought out more value by having this broader perspective. And then, you know, what was interesting in terms of presenting this to different boroughs in London was actually to how can we show to planners in the boroughs that taking a broader perspective is going to make their job easier rather than more difficult. And this was then kind of showing, well, look, if you're an upstream borough, what it means is that a downstream borough may have a good reason to spend money in your borough and you get a cheaper SUDS program as a result. Or if you're a downstream borough, you may be more cost effective for you to spend money in an upstream borough, indeed outside of the M25. And you know what's coming through this is, and this is I think one of the key findings in both projects, is that every project is a sensitization exercise in terms of bringing together people, not just an analytical exercise in bringing together systems, that we're bringing together people and, you know, we're all going on a journey of how to take a more holistic view and work through the practicalities of what it really means to work together. Now, I put this slide up. It looks fairly terrifying, but it's actually quite helpful in terms of what would collaboration look like. And it's fascinating, kind of, you realize most of us are on this diagram somewhere, but we only know our immediate vicinity, not the bigger picture. So what it shows on the left is these are timelines for river basin management planning at the top, WINEP in green, WRMPs, water resource management plans in blue, drainage and wastewater management plans in pale brown, then the business plans, and I suppose that's a peachy brown colour, FRMPs in grey. And what we're proposing is that, you know, whenever anybody finishes their plan, they would inform a central coordinating office who would do the modelling and would then provide that information of what the synergies are and what the multi-benefit options to other plans. And so that's the green arrows going back out. Other people, when they start a planning process, will be able to say, oh, yeah, this is a set of options which is out there. I could save money if I collaborate with these people. And this is what the diagram on the right is called, which we refer to as the summation of benefits diagram. So if you look at this diagram, what we've got at the top in blue is the benefits that you get from a water resources portfolio. Principally in column A, they are the water resource benefits, but in column C and column D, you'd see that there's flooding benefits and environmental benefits as well. Plus E to J is a whole load of best value benefits, so social outcomes and carbon sequestration and so on. And then in row 2, in the yellow, you've got your wastewater portfolio, and you could see, well, they are going to meet their requirement for connections, and they've got some environmental obligations, but again, co-benefits and best value benefits. Similarly, the environmental portfolio and the flooding portfolio in pink, environment in green, these planning objectives are going to come short of their targets in general, but they will have co-benefits. Now, if we have aligned our planning assumptions, our scenarios, our metrics, our costing assumptions, and so on, then what's now able to happen is that you can add these up, and that's the kind of second bottom row. You can add these benefits up, and what you then find is, for example, you might have a SUDS program which doesn't reach its, I think it's an 8:1 cost benefit threshold it needs to reach. Now, but it may have, say, a 25% kind of benefit in terms of water resources. And that in column A is the thin pink sliver. So if you're following this method, then that cost of the SUDS program could be transferred to the water resources portfolio. And then you find that the water resource portfolio can make savings by including cheaper schemes, such as a share of the SUDS program. And then you find column C and column D that the flooding and the environment portfolios would be able to achieve more because they've shared some of the cost with other portfolios. So that's the conceptual kind of vision of where this is going. And we think this is a, significant way forward in terms of, how planning could be joined up in the future. So this is my last slide. This is actually our last slide. Trevor and I kind of put this one together in terms of, well, what's been achieved so far, and where do we need to go with a kind of integrated systems-based approach to planning. I think the challenge is making complex systems manageable, but not kind of saying, oh, look, this is too complicated and we're going to carry on, go back to our silos. So it is more difficult, but in the future, we've got to get on top of this. And so we need to find that kind of interface between, yes, we can take this step towards integration, and it reflects reality better. So we've got to go in that direction. And I think there's some progress has been made across these projects. The system mapping as a collective understanding, not just an analytical task, as a means of verifying a set of metrics collectively. I think, that's been great to establish that as a method. I think what's great is to see increasing data variability. I mean, for example, Thames Water putting their CSO data on live land, and we're getting better at handling data. I think this progress has been made there. And I think Trevor and I both think it's really important that actually there's a cultural shift has begun in terms of a willingness to engage. But the devil is in the detail. And, we found this in WRSE, there'll be something quite simple, such as kind of planning your, getting a collective approach for water quality. Well, the data sharing protocols, or issues such as that, is it going to be on my SharePoint or your SharePoint or somebody else's SharePoint, or are we going to set up a macro for getting data out of an Excel spreadsheet or so on? All of these things take a lot of time. There's a lot of detail to actually implement this. And I think it's really important that we build on what's been done so far and learn those lessons about the detail, because that really matters. Anyway, we're on the journey now. And, what's great is we can have talks like this. We can say what's been done, rather than saying what we think just should be done. So I think we're on the move together, and that's very exciting to see that. And hopefully during AMP8, we'll be able to kind of progress with more pilots and demonstrations. And then we can really raise the ambition for PR 29 to have something substantially different. That would be a great place to get to. That's all from me. And so over to you, Ethny.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And thank you to you, Trevor, as well, for those really interesting presentations. It's great to hear about systems thinking approaches being used in practice, and particularly interesting to see kind of how co-benefits can be identified and budgets used more effectively. So thank you for that. To all our attendees, please do put your questions for Brendan and Trevor in the Q&A box, and we'll kick off the Q&A session now. So firstly, I'd just kind of like to ask, what were some of the key success factors for bringing together the necessary stakeholders to take forward an approach such as this? For example, did you do systems thinking training or anything like that? Brendan, Trevor, I'll put that out to both of you.
Do you want to start, Brendan?
There you go ahead, Trev.
So I guess, and I hope people don't take this the wrong way, but I think 10 years ago, systems thinking, when you mentioned to senior executives in water companies and big businesses, sounded quite academic and sort of wasn't hardwired into their way of thinking. I think the climate and environmental emergency has really hit home with very senior people now because of the level of risk involved and their responsibilities for the future. And I think that they are very clever people, and they've realised that planning in silos is simply not going to work. The world doesn't work that way, and we can't work in that way. If we're under a stable climate, that's one thing. With a very dynamic climate, with deep uncertainty within that dynamic relationships that are there and our dependencies on the natural environment, then people are more open to these ideas. The trick, as Brendan said, is making what is incredibly complex simple enough for people to be able to understand and to use within the jobs they do. and I don't mean this negatively, but legislation and regulation take a little bit longer to catch up, and people will follow the policies and the processes they've been told to do until they change to some extent, apart from sort of people at sort of the sharp end of things. So that cultural element is really important. But I think the work that Brendan's been talking about, showing the art of the possible, you know, bringing people together, co-creating, just winning hearts and minds is really important. It won't happen. There won't be a critical point. It happens overnight. It's quite a long, slow journey, but we're on that path, I think, now. Brendan?
Thanks. I think the key thing is always to remember we are joining up groups of people who see the system differently, rather than just doing a mega piece of analysis. When system mapping is done badly, we've got a word for it. It looks like a plate of spaghetti, and we call it horrendogram, and it puts everybody off. So that's why always I build up a system map very, very gently, so as not to scare anybody off as we're doing it, but also to bear in mind that the fact that, you know, say the agricultural community or the environmental community or you know, the utilities or infrastructure, they've got a different understanding of what the system is, and we've got to value that diversity, because no one group understands the system perfectly. And if everybody goes in with that mindset of being willing to listen and, you know, learn and see different perspectives, then you can make some real headway. But if you go in and say, right, I've got the whole thing mapped, here it is, chaps, you know, then you know you're hiding to nothing, really.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And so what would you say is the biggest enabler of transitioning to systems-based planning across the entire UK water system? Is it about that collaboration, or do you think there's something else as well?
You start this time, Brendan.
Okay. So I think, you know, the things like, you know, the national framework, you know, was great in setting ambition. So I think it's been fantastic, you know, that those high level kind of messages are out there. But I think in addition to that, it's also a kind of building blocks, you know, setting precedents. Nothing's more convincing, I think, than a precedent and say, well, you know, it's been done before, but this time we want to do a bit extra. And so I think just bearing in mind that we've got to have both of those processes. And I think now is the time to cast that vision for the PR29, to say, okay, look, let's carry on building and exploring in the coming years. But then let's set that vision for a really integrated approach for PR29 and work towards that. So I think a lot of energy needs to go into that now.
So the only bit to add to that for me, so co-creation and hearts and minds is really important, but also updating where we are with our processes, regulations and policies is important. I've got a meeting with colleagues in the Environment Agency tomorrow looking at catchment and nature-based solutions, and the fact that all too often they drop out of the planning process because their benefits are spread across multiple sort of funding regimes and activities and planning processes. And we all know we're missing some really big opportunities. But the legislation and the regulations are set the way they are for a very good reason. So, you know, I think there's also a little bit of work to do around there, which I think is in play now, and people are having those discussions.
Great, thank you both. And on a practical level, do either of you have any recommendations for tools and resources for systems mapping?
We use Kumu, which is online, and there's a free version or version you can pay for. And I think CCAN have developed a tool. So it depends how good your Kumu skills are. I'm fortunate I've got someone clever in my team who can do bits.
Great, thank you. And in terms of when you've created the systems map and you use these for modelling, what is the role of monitoring and evaluating any interventions that come through, and then kind of creating more robust systems maps?
So just to say that I learned this technique kind of working in international development. I was with the UN on environment and peace building, where this kind of participatory analysis of environment and social problems really matters. And I ran a £20 million program for DFID, where we had lots of different environmental interventions, and our end result, we claimed, was a reduction in conflict over natural resources. And you can use the system map, with people who know the context well, to say, look, these are the interfaces between kind of social dynamics and natural resource use. And then as a body that was spending money, we then translated that into the evaluation framework. And so year on year, I had to report against not just our actions, the interventions that we took, but at different stages in the overall system towards kind of conflict and governance, we had to report on, what was the impact it was making. And if you look at, you may be familiar with the Green Book on cost-benefit analysis in this country. If you look at the Magenta Book and the policy evaluation, that kind of evaluation framework and complex systems analysis, which has been common in international development for a long time, is now increasingly being applied in the UK, and for all kinds of complex problems, whether that's obesity or knife crime or environmental governance, as it is in this case. There's a growing set of expertise around how to do that collaborative planning and evaluation over the long term. So have a look at that and international development practice, because I think there's a lot to learn there.
Just on, I think it's a really, really important question. I think it's quite easy to fall into the trap to think that systems are fixed, and once you've mapped them, that is it. But I think under a dynamic climate with lots of new and different pressures, there may be situations where the systems themselves change, particularly the natural environment, critical thresholds, positive feedback loops, etc. within those systems, that not just change the outcomes and the relationship, but maybe potentially even change the system themselves. So that monitoring and that continual review is really important. And arguably, it might prove to be one of the most important aspects of system mapping overall.
Great, thank you. And that's really useful. I've got a comment from an attendee here who said that they had a first-year degree book called Environmental Systems in the 1980s, but that it stopped being published and was highly sought after. Do you think the systems tools, and importantly the metrics that you talked about today, will make it easier for land use planners to understand the impact of proposals, for example, with regard to climate adaptation?
Brendan, one for you.
Yes, definitely. There's different examples across government of, look at the land use futures work. Lots of different. And I think the work of CCAN, the University of Surrey, have been supporting DEFRA in developing this kind of evaluation framework. It's very relevant for ELM Tier 3 kind of collaborative working. It's very relevant for blended finance. Because you can look at, the attribution. If you're making these impacts, these are the benefits which come out of it. How do they work in combination? Who's interested in paying for this by seeing what they get from that? And so I think this kind of tool has a lot of significance for the kind of blended finance that we've got to get to for our land management.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in terms of questions today. Really appreciate you coming on and presenting, Trevor and Brendan. So thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting presentation, and we'd be interested to hear how it progresses. So please do keep us updated. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us today. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. And don't forget to record your attendance on the IES CPD tool if you're an IES member. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. Please do subscribe to our channel, like the video and hit the bell, and you'll then get notifications of when we publish new content. Our next webinar will be held tomorrow at the same time, and will be on implementing ESIA, what ESIA practitioners need to know about translating ESIA into action on the ground. And you can register for this on our website. Thank you once again, Brendan, Trevor. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.